Alright, we got some new brake parts. Akabono ceramic brake pads, made in USA. Now there's something you don't see very often anymore. Coated brake rotors. The brake rotors came with mounting screws. That's cool. Also, we have stainless steel braided brake hoses. Some weird gummy candy. Stickers! I mean, decals. The brakes on the BMW are getting pretty bad. There's only about 2 to 3 millimeters of friction material left on the pads, and the rotors are severely worn. Plus, the rubber hoses are starting to crack. And last but not least, the brake fluid looks like iced tea. We're going to take care of all this stuff in one shot. So grab a drink and a snack, because this might take a minute. Since I'm replacing the rubber hoses, I'm going to break them loose before I disassemble anything. It's easier to do this now instead of waiting until the calipers are hanging loose. The hoses have a 14mm hex on the end that attaches to the caliper. The front and rear calipers both have that. Where the hose is attached to the hard lines, the hose takes a 17mm wrench and the hard line has an 11mm fitting. I would suggest using the 2-wrench method, because if you try to use just one wrench, it's going to twist the hose instead of loosening the connection. At this point, we don't want to disconnect the hoses. We just want to break them loose so they can be easily removed later. Alright, let's move on to the calipers. Before removing the calipers, we first need to remove these spring clips. Off camera, I easily removed one of them by pushing it toward the caliper and prying it away from the rotor at the same time. Of course, when I turned on the camera to show you how easy it is, it turned into an epic struggle. Anyway, the clips on the front and rear calipers are removed the same way. Each caliper has 2 mounting bolts, and they have plastic caps on them to protect them, or at least they should. Luckily, my car still has all the plastic caps. The caliper bolts use a 7mm hex key. This is true for both the front and rear brakes. Before removing the calipers, I'm going to unclip the hoses from the mounting brackets. On the front brakes, they just pop loose. But on the rear brakes, they have retainer clips. The retainer clip is on a bracket mounted to the trailing arm. I worked it loose with a screwdriver. Now we can remove the calipers. I used a big screwdriver as a prying tool to compress the caliper piston a little bit. This makes it easier to remove, especially if the rotor has big grooves on it. I am also going to remove the caliper mounting brackets. Since my car has the wheel stud conversion, the brackets need to be removed in order to remove the brake rotors. But that's okay, because I want to clean the brackets anyway. Speaking of rotors, let's remove those now. The mounting screw takes a 6mm hex key. I had to tap on the rotor with a mallet to loosen it up. Once again, this procedure is the same for the front and rear brakes. And finally, I'm going to disconnect the caliper from the brake hose. The fitting on the hose doesn't swivel, so you have to rotate the caliper to unscrew it. Then I disconnected the hoses from the hard lines and capped them off. I used a C-clamp to compress the caliper piston. The fluid that came out was a dark brownish color. Good thing I bought a big bottle of brake fluid. Looks like I'm gonna need it. The rear brakes are pretty much the same. The calipers use the same size hex key. The brackets use the same size socket. You can use a big screwdriver to loosen the caliper piston, and so on. Oh, I forgot to mention the brake wear sensors. On my car, the front left and rear right brakes have wear sensors. They just clip into the brake pad. I was able to pry it out with a small screwdriver. Before installing the new brake parts, I'm going to clean up the calipers and brackets. I used Super Clean tire and wheel cleaner since it's designed to remove brake dust. It did a pretty good job. I also decided to paint the calipers. I had a can of red brake caliper paint left over from another project, so I decided to use it. I used the old brake rotors and some cardboard from the shipping boxes to mask off the area. I put 2 coats of the red paint and 2 coats of clear coat. Then I let it dry overnight. The next day I removed those old rotors and started the assembly process. Assembly is basically the opposite of removal, except I'm being more careful because I don't want to scratch that fresh paint. I decided to thread the brake lines into the calipers before installing them. That way I don't have to do the whole spin the caliper thing. Now I'll torque the caliper bolts and attach the brake hoses to the hard lines. The rear brakes are basically the same, except the bolts for the brackets have a different torque spec. Also, don't forget the clips for those mounting brackets. And the brake wear sensors need to be reinstalled in the left front and right rear brake pads. Last but not least is my arch nemesis, the spring clip. I found a trick for installing them. First you angle the clip toward the caliper. Then you push the clip toward the caliper with your thumbs and rotate it into place. I didn't even scratch the paint. Now that all the hardware is installed, it's time to flush out the old brake fluid. Like I mentioned earlier, it was pretty gross. So I bought a big bottle of brake fluid to completely flush out the system. There are many different ways to bleed the brake fluid. I won't go into great detail about that. If you're doing this job yourself, just pick your favorite method. I decided to use a one-man bleeder kit. It gets the job done, but gives your leg a good workout. On each caliper, I kept bleeding it until the fluid coming out was a nice amber color. During the process, I had to drain that cup many times. I also had to refill the master cylinder many times. It's really important to make sure the master cylinder does not run dry, because then it'll put air bubbles into the ABS unit. And then you have to bleed the ABS unit, which requires special tools. Anyway, when you're done, the fluid in the master cylinder should look like this. Alright, the install is done. Let's get the car back on the ground and break in the new brakes. It's important to bed the brakes so the pads and the rotors will play nicey-nice with each other. Basically, you make multiple stops, one after the other, until you feel the brakes starting to smooth out. Different manufacturers may specify slightly different procedures, so it's a good idea to check the instructions that come with the brake pads. Anyway, here's what the brake pads look like after break-in. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.